"I'm sorry, I can't marry you. My parents would never accept such a poor daughter-in-law." I just smiled and walked away. They had no idea who I really was. Days later, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The first thing Miranda Harper did when I stepped out of Julian's car was look at my hem, not my face, not my eyes. The hem of my dress, navy blue, perfectly tailored, not a designer label she would recognize, and I watched her eyes linger there for exactly 1 second longer than polite, and I thought, there it is, the tell, the one that tells you everything about a person before they've said a single word. She smiled after that, a tight, frozen arrangement of facial muscles that had nothing to do with warmth. "Julian," she said, touching his arm, looking past me. "You look thin. Are you eating?" Julian squeezed my hand. His palm was clammy. I filed that away too. The Blackwood Hills Country Club smelled like old money, fresh lilies, and the specific kind of quiet that settles over rooms where everyone already knows everyone else's net worth. Italian marble floors, antique crystal chandeliers, the careful, performative hush of people who have confused wealth with sophistication for so many generations that they've forgotten there's a difference. I had been in 100 rooms like this one. I had bought buildings that contained rooms like this one. I walked through the lobby with my shoulders back and my face neutral, and I let Miranda Harper lead us to the private dining room as though she were doing me a favor. Charles Harper was already seated, swirling scotch in a crystal glass, wearing the expression of a man who had pre-decided the outcome of the evening. He was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, the kind of physical presence that gets described as commanding in boardrooms and intimidating everywhere else. He didn't stand when I entered. He didn't offer his hand. He looked at me the way you look at a piece of art you're considering for a wall in your office, not with interest, but with appraisal. "So," he said, before we had even unfolded our napkins, "Julian tells us you work in operations." "That's right," I said. "Vague," he said, like the word itself was a verdict. "What's your family's portfolio? Investments? Real estate?" I had anticipated this. My entire adult life, I had been surrounded by people exactly like the Harpers, people for whom a human being's value was a function of their balance sheet, their last name, the right schools on their resume in the right sequence. It was the very reason I had built my public persona the way I had. Simple apartment, modest wardrobe, no name dropping, no number dropping. I had wanted for once in my life to be loved for the things that couldn't be valued. My mind, my humor, my instincts, the way I argued about ideas at 2 a.m. over cold takeout. Julian, with his fire escape proposals and his cheap pizza and his apparent total indifference to what I drove or where I lived, had seemed like the answer to a question I'd been asking for years. I looked directly at Charles and told him the truth I had built my public life around. "My mother is a retired nurse in Arizona," I said. "My father passed away when I was 16. I work in operations and acquisitions at a company called Apex Logistics. I pay my own rent in a 1-bedroom downtown. I have a 401k, a healthy credit score, and I'm very proud of what I've built for myself." The temperature at the table dropped 5 degrees in real time. Miranda dabbed her lips with a linen napkin. "How industrious of you, dear," she murmured. The condescension was so thick you could have spread it on bread. Julian's breathing had gone shallow beside me. I could hear it. For 10 minutes, the only sounds in the room were silverware and ice. Then Charles set down his fork, looked at a spot on the wall behind Julian's head, and said, "Julian, your mother and I need a word, in the hallway." Julian stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. He didn't look at me. He just followed them out like a dog that had been trained so thoroughly it didn't need a leash anymore. I sat alone at their enormous table, surrounded by half-eaten lobster, and I timed it on my watch. 12 minutes and 40 seconds. I spent those 12 minutes and 40 seconds doing something the Harpers would never have expected. I was perfectly fine. No sweating palms, no churning stomach. I sat straight and I breathed evenly, and I watched the waitstaff pretend not to notice me, and I thought, with a clarity that felt almost clinical, he's going to come back and end this, and he's going to apologize as though that makes it his decision rather than theirs. I was right on both counts. When Julian came back, his face was the color of old chalk. He asked if we could get some air, gesturing toward the terrace doors, and I followed him out into the cold because I wanted to hear him say it out loud. The fog was thick over the golf course. The club's neon sign cast a greenish light over everything. "I'm sorry," he said, to the perfectly pruned hedges. "For what, Julian?" The words came out in a rush, shame and relief tangled together. The sound of a man who has been holding something terrible and is finally putting it down. His parents were categorically opposed. A poor daughter-in-law would be a social and financial embarrassment. He would be disinherited. He was sorry. He was so sorry. I waited until he finished. "Are you choosing them over me?" I asked. He looked at the pavement. That silence. I have heard a lot of silences in my life. The silence of a boardroom before a vote. The silence after a term sheet gets rejected. The silence of a room when the numbers come in and they're either very good or very bad. But that silence, on that terrace, in that greenish fog, was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was a complete sentence. It was a paragraph. It was the answer to every question I should have asked 6 months earlier. Something inside me simply switched off. Not dramatically. Not with tears or a raised voice. It was the clean, efficient severing of a circuit. The kind that happens not from rage, but from clarity. I took the ring off. It was a simple silver band. The one he had put on my finger on his fire escape at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. The one he had said was the only kind of ring that mattered, because he only cared about me. I pressed it into his palm. We're done, I said. You didn't want me, Julian. You wanted the idea of me, the simple love story, the uncomplicated girl, the version of intimacy that doesn't cost you any goodbye. I walked to the parking lot. My heels were steady on the concrete. I did not look back. I booked a car from the app before I reached the lot's edge, and by the time I was in the back seat heading home, I had already opened my email and was reviewing the draft restructuring memo my CFO had sent that afternoon. Because that is the thing about people who have built things from nothing. The work doesn't stop because someone disappointed you. The work is, in many ways, the point. I want to tell you about the work because you need to understand what I actually was before the rest of this story makes its full weight felt. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Cincinnati, Ohio. My father was an electrician. My mother was an ER nurse who worked double shifts on weekends and kept a color-coded budget spreadsheet on the refrigerator that tracked every dollar that came in and went out. When my father died of a cardiac event at 44, no warning, a Tuesday afternoon, gone before the ambulance arrived, my mother didn't collapse. She picked up a 3rd shift. She did it for 2 years so I could go to college without loans. I paid her back. Every dollar, with interest, she refused to accept, which I deposited quietly into a savings account in her name that I revealed on her 65th birthday. But that's a different story. I put myself through business school on scholarship and part-time work, graduated at the top of my class, and took a job at a mid-market logistics firm in Chicago, where I spent 4 years learning exactly how supply chains fail, the specific pressure points, the mismanagement patterns, the operational blind spots that turn profitable companies into expensive disasters. Then I left and built something myself. Apex Logistics was incorporated in 2016 with $2, $3 million in seed capital, most of it mine, the rest from 2 investors who had watched me work and decided the risk was worth it. The company's thesis was simple. We found logistics and distribution companies that were operationally sound but catastrophically managed, acquired them at distressed valuations, rebuilt the leadership structure and operational framework from the ground up, and either held them for cash flow or sold them at multiples that made everyone involved very happy. By the time I met Julian at a fundraising gala on a Wednesday evening in April of last year, Apex had $1.4 billion in assets under management across 11 portfolio companies. I was 36 years old. My office was the penthouse suite of the Apex Tower, 60 stories of black steel and glass in the financial district, with floor-to-ceiling windows and an antique mahogany desk that had belonged to a railroad baron. I told people I worked in operations. It was true. It was also the most useful filter I had ever built. I told Julian I worked in operations. He said cool, asked if I wanted the last piece of pizza, and spent the next 40 minutes making me laugh harder than I had laughed in years. He seemed to genuinely not care about money. He drove a 7-year-old Subaru. He wore the same flannel jacket to 4 consecutive dates. When I ordered the cheap wine, he didn't blink. I thought I had finally found the exception. What I had actually found was a coward in comfortable clothing, but I didn't know that yet. I went back to work the morning after the country club. I reviewed the Apex acquisition pipeline. I took 3 calls from portfolio company CEOs. I had lunch at my desk, a turkey sandwich from the place on the corner, nothing fancy. And by 2 p.m. I had largely stopped thinking about Julian Harper and had started thinking about a restructuring proposal for a struggling freight forwarder in Memphis that my senior analyst, Patrick Lowe, had flagged the previous week. Patrick was 29, methodical to the point of being almost meditative, and had the specific gift of finding operational value inside what looked like chaos. He had joined Apex 3 years earlier from McKinsey and was, in my assessment, one of the best analysts working in the sector. He knocked on my office door at 3:47 p.m. and set a red-bordered folder on my desk. Harper Enterprises, he said. I looked up. Mid-tier manufacturing. Inherited 3rd generation. They've been trying to get a meeting with you for 6 months. He sat down. They're over-leveraged by a factor of 3. Their Q4 earnings involved what our forensic accounting consultant believes was channel stuffing, and they are approximately 60 days from a default that will trigger a covenant cascade across their entire debt structure. He paused. Their assets are actually solid. The mismanagement is the problem, not the underlying business. I opened the folder. On the first page, under the company overview, was the name of the primary contact, Charles Whitfield Harper, chairman and CEO, Harper Enterprises. I sat with that for a moment. Pull everything on the ownership and executive structure, I said. Full background on Charles Harper personally, and get me a complete history of their acquisition outreach. Every email, every intermediary contact, every gift basket. I looked at Patrick. They've been sending gift baskets? 4 of them, Patrick said. One included a very expensive bottle of Burgundy. Who drank it? David took it home. Good, I said. Close the door on your way out. I spent the next 90 minutes reading. Harper Enterprises was exactly what Patrick had described. A company built on solid foundational assets, a regional manufacturing base with real value that had been running on inherited momentum for a decade and was now discovering that momentum runs out. The forensic accounting summary prepared by our outside firm, Callaway & Stern, whose lead partner, Diane Reeves, had 30 years of financial due diligence experience and a reputation that made CFOs nervous, was careful in its language but clear in its implications. The Q4 numbers had been dressed. The debt covenants had been tripped and quietly renegotiated twice in the past 18 months. The company was running out of runway, and Charles Harper had been sending Apex gift baskets and increasingly desperate meeting requests for 6 months, begging for a conversation with the anonymous CEO, known in financial circles only as M. Vance. I closed the folder, looked out at the city for a while, then I called my legal team. My outside M&A counsel was a woman named Teresa Van, 23 years in transactions, formerly of Weil Gotshal, now running her own boutique firm that handled nothing but complex acquisitions. She had negotiated 7 of Apex's 11 portfolio acquisitions. She was precise, unsentimental, and constitutionally incapable of missing a detail. Teresa, I said, I need the Harper Enterprises file locked down. Full disclosure request, accelerated timeline. I want the forensic accounting completed and the legal structure bulletproof before we go anywhere near a meeting. What's your concern? She asked. Personal connection, I said. The chairman's son was recently my fiance. A beat. Was, I confirmed. Do you want to step back from this one? I thought about it for less time than I probably should have. No, but I want everything independently verified and documented so thoroughly that the acquisition rationale is inarguable on its own terms. This cannot look like anything other than exactly what it is. Understood, Teresa said. Give me 2 weeks. She came back in 12 days. The documentation package was 280 pages. Callaway and Stern's forensic accounting report identified 3 separate instances of earnings manipulation totaling approximately $4.7 million in fabricated revenue across 2 fiscal years. The legal analysis confirmed that the channel stuffing methodology used would constitute securities fraud under SEC guidelines if the company were publicly traded. It wasn't, but the underlying conduct and intent were documented in internal communications that Harper's own finance team had, apparently, been careless enough to preserve in writing. Teresa flagged those emails with a notation that said simply, Exhibit D, do not lose. I called Patrick Lowe into my office on a Thursday morning and told him the acquisition was approved for the next stage. I told him to schedule the meeting with the Harper Enterprises executive team for the following Tuesday at 9 a.m. through standard channels under the Apex Logistics letterhead, with no reference to M. Vance by name. What name should we use for the meeting host? Patrick asked. None, I said. Just the company. They know who they're coming to see. He nodded. He was good enough at his job to understand there was a layer here he didn't need to ask about. That Sunday, my assistant David, 12 years with me, the keeper of every secret I'd accumulated over a decade of building this company, came to my home office with a tablet and a look on his face I recognized as the specific expression he wore when something had happened that was both professionally significant and personally satisfying. The Harper Enterprises legal team did something unusual this morning, he said. Apparently someone in their office finally ran a deep search on the unredacted SEC corporate registry, the one that isn't publicly indexed. He set the tablet on my desk. They wanted to verify the ownership structure before Tuesday's meeting. The SEC filing was on the screen. The full legal name of the founder, majority shareholder, and CEO of Apex Logistics, Maya Eleanor Vance. That explains the 12 missed calls since 8 a.m., David said. I leaned back in my chair. There's something else, David said. He swiped to a social media page. Miranda Harper's account, linked in the identification documents Charles's team had submitted as part of their disclosure package, the specific kind of procedural oversight that happens when lawyers are working fast and panicking. At the top of her feed, posted 3 days after the country club dinner, was a photo. Julian and his parents laughing at what was clearly the same private dining room. I was cropped out of the frame with the kind of casual, careless editing that suggests the person behind it didn't think it needed more effort than that. The caption read, "So proud of our Julian for making the right choice. Our family deserves royalty, not a charity case. Dodged a bullet, our family first." I looked at it for a long time. The word that stayed with me was charity case, not the insult in it, but the specific architecture of the belief behind it. The absolute comfortable certainty that a woman who paid her own rent and answered honestly about her background was by definition lesser. That the honest answer, the one I'd given without shame because I had nothing to be ashamed of, was proof of inadequacy rather than proof of character. Block the calls until Tuesday, I said. All of them. Julian, Charles, Miranda. If they email, the auto response is the standard acquisition timeline communication. And if they show up at the building, they won't, I said. They'll wait. They need this too much to risk offending us. I was right. They waited. Tuesday morning, 8:45 a.m. I watched them arrive on the lobby security feed from my office on the 62nd floor. They didn't stride in. That's the thing I remember most clearly. The Harpers, who had looked at me across a marble table at their country club and found me wanting, shuffled into the Apex lobby like people who had just realized the ground under them was glass. The building was doing what it was designed to do. Communicate scale, communicate permanence, communicate the specific authority of an institution that didn't need to announce itself because everything about it already had. Charles was sweating through his bespoke suit. He kept pulling at his collar. Miranda clutched her Birkin bag not the way you carry a status symbol, but the way you hold a life preserver, desperately, two-handed, knuckles white. And Julian looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days, which, given that he had spent those 3 days calling my blocked number from various phones, was probably accurate. I gave them 22 minutes in conference room A. I watched them on the closed circuit feed. Charles paced. Miranda sat completely still in a way that looked less like composure and more like a person who had stopped trusting their own legs. Julian stared at the table. At one point, Charles leaned down and said something to him in a hissed whisper, and Julian shook his head and Charles grabbed the back of a chair hard enough that his knuckles went white. I stood up from my desk at 9:07 a.m. I was wearing a charcoal Tom Ford pantsuit I had bought the week Apex crossed $1 billion in assets, the one I wore only to meetings that required a specific kind of presence, heels that hit marble like a gavel. I had spent 22 years building the kind of confidence that doesn't need to perform itself, and I let it carry me down the hallway. David met me at the conference room doors. "Ready?" he said. "Open them," I said. The three Harpers jumped to their feet when the doors swung open. The instinct of people who have been waiting and know it, who understand they are in the petitioner position and are trying to compensate with body language. They had arranged their faces into expressions of corporate goodwill, hopeful, deferential, the masks of people who need something and are trying not to show how badly. I walked through the doors without looking at them. I walked directly to the head of the table. I set my portfolio down. I sat. I folded my hands and looked up. I watched the masks come off in stages. Charles first, the blood leaving his face with the speed of a man who has just understood something catastrophic. His mouth opening without producing sound, his body actually swaying slightly backward before he caught himself on the edge of the table. Miranda next, a sound from her throat like something very small and fragile being crushed, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes going wide and then immediately filling. Julian last. And Julian's face was the most complicated of the three, because it moved through horror and recognition, and then, heartbreakingly, through a brief flash of something desperate and hopeful that he couldn't quite kill fast enough to hide. The silence lasted 8 seconds. I counted. "You're Monsieur Vance," Charles said. It wasn't quite a question. It was a man reading the last line of a document and realizing he'd misread every page that came before it. "Ms. Vance in this room, Charles," I said. I opened the acquisition file. The pages landed on the glass table with a sound like a door closing. "I've spent the past 2 weeks reviewing Harper Enterprises' financial position in detail," I said. "You are over-leveraged by a factor of 3. Your Q4 earnings involve channel stuffing that our forensic accounting team has documented across 3 separate fiscal periods, totaling approximately $4.7 million in fabricated revenue. You are 30 days from a payroll default and 60 days from a covenant cascade that will accelerate every debt instrument in your capital structure simultaneously." I looked at him steadily. "You came here because Apex is the only institution willing to even sit in a room with you. Everyone else has already done this math and walked away." Miranda moved before Charles did. She leaned forward across the table, the desperation breaking through the composure completely, and her voice came out thick and wet in a way I had not expected. Real grief, I realized, but grief for the money, for the club membership, for the social position, the grief of a woman who had organized her entire identity around things that were now dissolving. "Maya, please," she said. "We were wrong, completely wrong. We had no idea who you were. You are clearly brilliant, extraordinary. We would be so honored to have you in our family. We can begin again, all of us. We can—" "A family conversation," I said. "Like the one you called at the country club, Miranda?" She stopped. I reached for my pen. "After full review, I cannot approve this acquisition," I said. I drew a line through the cover page. Single stroke, clean. "Apex Logistics is categorically opposed to investing in a company this poorly managed, this financially compromised, and this fundamentally lacking in the kind of leadership integrity our portfolio requires." Julian came around the table. I had not expected that. He crossed the room and crouched beside my chair, which was such a complete abandonment of every professional norm in the room that even his father made a sound. His eyes were red, his hands were shaking. "Maya," he said, "I love you. I have always loved you. It was them, the pressure, the disinheritance. I was terrified, and I made the worst decision of my life, and I know that. Please, give me another chance. We can fix this. All of it." I did not look at him. I looked at Charles. "My personal relationships are not relevant to this meeting," I said. "What is relevant is that your Q4 fabrications are documented in your own internal correspondence, copies of which my legal team has preserved. Teresa Van, who has been my M&A counsel for 9 years, has reviewed every document in this file, and her assessment is unambiguous." I stood up. Julian stayed crouched beside where I had been sitting, which meant I was now standing over him, which I suspected was not how he had imagined this conversation ending. "The meeting is concluded. David will show you out." "You're killing us," Charles said, not angrily, just the flat statement of a man who has arrived at a fact. "Without this acquisition, we're finished." "Yes," I said. "You are. You're doing this because of Christmas," he said, "because of what Miranda posted, because of the dinner." I looked at him for a moment. "I'm doing this," I said, "because your company is a bad investment. The dinner is why I looked closely enough to confirm that. If you hadn't been so confident I was beneath your notice, your lawyers might have run the registry search 6 months ago, before this file got this bad." I picked up my portfolio. "That's not my problem, Charles. That's yours." I pressed the intercom. "David, conference room A." The doors opened. The security team that walked in, 2 men, calm and efficient, the specific professionalism of people who have escorted unwilling parties from rooms enough times that it no longer registers as dramatic to them, did not need to physically intervene. Charles walked out on his own, slowly, the walk of a man who has just had something very large and heavy set down on him. Miranda followed, crying without trying to stop it, the mascara tracking down in lines that she didn't bother to wipe. Julian stood up from beside my chair. He looked at me one more time. "The fire escape," he said. "That was real. I need you to know that was real." "I know it was," I said. "It wasn't enough." The doors closed. The room was quiet. I stood at the window for a moment and watched a hawk working the thermal off the building across the street, riding it in slow circles, effortless, going nowhere in particular, entirely in its element. Then I went back to work. The Harper Enterprises bankruptcy filing made the financial press 17 days later. Chapter 11. The full cascade exactly as Teresa had predicted. The covenant default triggered the acceleration clauses triggered the creditor calls triggered the asset seizures, and the whole structure came apart the way over-leveraged structures always do, with a speed that would have seemed shocking if you hadn't read the file. The estate in the suburbs, the one with the tennis courts and the guest cottage and the professionally maintained gardens, was listed within 30 days. The Blackwood Hills Country Club membership was revoked for non-payment of dues in the same week. Charles was named in 2 investor lawsuits alleging misrepresentation of financial condition. The forensic accounting findings that Callaway and Stern had prepared for our due diligence were subpoenaed by the plaintiff's counsel in the second suit. Diane Reeves testified in a deposition that lasted 11 hours. Miranda filed for divorce in February. I read about it in a brief item in the business section of the city paper, 3 paragraphs. The specific terse coverage reserved for the falls of people who had never been prominent enough to receive full articles on the way up. Julian, from what I heard through the industry network, the quiet circulation of information that moves through the financial district like water finding its level, could not find work in the sector. His name had become attached to the Harper story in ways that made him unemployable in the world his parents had groomed him for. He was, as far as anyone could tell, learning for the first time what it felt like to start from nothing. I hoped he'd figure it out. I genuinely did. Not out of warmth for him specifically, but because I knew from direct personal experience that starting from nothing, done honestly, was one of the more clarifying experiences available to a human being. It had clarifying properties that no amount of inherited comfort could replicate. I found the silver ring in my desk drawer on a Wednesday afternoon in March, 6 weeks after the bankruptcy filing. I had forgotten it was there. I picked it up and looked at it for a moment. The ring from the fire escape, the one that was supposed to mean he was the exception, the one that fit everything I had wanted to believe about him. It felt like exactly what it was, a piece of metal. I dropped it in the wastebasket. It didn't make a sound. That evening I ordered pad thai from the restaurant around the corner from my building, $14.50. The same order I had been getting since I moved to the city 14 years earlier, and took it out onto my penthouse balcony and ate it looking out at the lights. The city was very clear that night, the kind of cold, bright clarity that only happens in late winter when the air has been scoured clean by a week of hard weather. A text came in from an unknown number just after 9 p.m. The preview read, "Maya, it's Julian. I'm standing outside your building. I can see your lights. Please just come down. I have nothing." I read the first sentence and deleted the message and blocked the number without reading the rest. I have nothing. 3 words. The precise distance between who he had been and who he was discovering he needed to become. The exact beginning of a kind of education that no one volunteers for, and everyone who has survived it is better for having had. The Harpers had looked at my honest answers, my plain dress, my 1-bedroom apartment, and seen poverty. They didn't understand, couldn't understand from inside the life they'd built, that poverty isn't a bank balance. It's the terror of losing an inherited position so profound that you will throw away every real thing in your life to protect it. It's the blindness that comes from never having had to build something from nothing, never having had to discover what you're actually made of when there's no floor under you and no one coming to help. I had known what I was made of since I was 16 years old, standing in a hospital hallway learning that my father was gone, watching my mother straighten her back and start calculating what would need to happen next. That was my inheritance, not a country club membership, not a maintained estate. The knowledge that you can lose everything and still be standing. The certainty that the thing you build with your own hands cannot be taken from you the same way the things you inherit can, because it is not separate from you, it is you. I finished my noodles. The city kept going, indifferent and magnificent. I had not married into royalty. I had not needed to. I had built a kingdom while they were polishing inherited silver, and in my kingdom, the only person who determined my worth had always been me. I went inside, set the empty container on the counter, and went back to work.